The crystal tumbler shattered against the marble floor, sending shards of Waterford glass across Richard Ashworth's pristine office like frozen tears. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan's skyline glittered with the cold promise of another sleepless night, but inside his penthouse office, darkness had already claimed him. "Sir, the board is demanding answers about the Meridian deal." Vincent's voice crackled through the intercom, cautious as always when delivering bad news. Richard pressed his palms against the mahogany desk that had once belonged to a railroad, barren, feeling the weight of his empire crumbling beneath his fingertips. 42 years old, worth $3 billion. And he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt anything other than the hollow ache of perfect isolation. "Tell the board they'll have their answers when I'm ready to give them," his voice carried. The authority of a man who could bankrupt nations with a phone call, yet couldn't buy himself a single moment of genuine human connection. The intercom fell silent. Even Vincent, who'd worked for him for 8 years, had learned to retreat when Richard's mood turned this dark. It was better that way, safer. Richard walked to the window, his reflection a ghostly overlay on the city. Below, handsome in the way that old money demanded, with steel-gray eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. His tailored suit cost more than most people's cars, his watch more than their homes, yet he felt like a beggar dressed in borrowed finery. The knock on his door came soft but insistent. "Come in." His housekeeper of 15 years, Mrs. Chen, entered with the careful steps of someone approaching a sleeping tiger. She'd seen him build his fortune from millions to billions, had watched him grow colder with each success. "Mr. Ashworth, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's something you need to know." Richard didn't turn from the window. The city pulsed below him like a living thing, millions of people going about their lives, loving, laughing, crying, everything he'd forgotten how to do. "The staff has asked me to speak for them," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice trembling slightly. "We've all decided to tender our resignations effective immediately." Now he turned, his expression unreadable. "All of you, sir?" "The gardeners, the security team, the drivers, the kitchen staff, everyone." She placed a sealed envelope on his desk. "We're grateful for the employment, but we can't continue working in an environment where human dignity is treated as an inconvenience." Richard felt something twist in his chest, sensation he hadn't experienced in so long he'd almost forgotten its name. Shame. "I see. You're not a bad man, Mr. Ashworth," Mrs. Chen said softly, "but you've forgotten how to be a good one. Perhaps this is your chance to remember." After she left, Richard stood alone in his cavernous office, surrounded by priceless art, an empty silence. He picked up the resignation letter, scanning the carefully worded paragraphs that essentially said the same thing his ex-wife had screamed at him during their divorce 3 years ago. "You've become a machine. Beautiful, brilliant, heartless machine." His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. "Sir, I've contacted every staffing agency in the tri-state area. Word travels fast in domestic circles. I'm afraid you've been blacklisted." Richard almost smiled at that. The man who could have anyone in the world working for him had been deemed unemployable by housekeepers and gardeners. There was a certain poetic justice to it. Another text followed. "There's one small agency in Queens, Estrella Home Services. They specialize in difficult placements. Should I make contact?" He typed back a single word. "Yes." As night deepened around his empty mansion in the Upper East Side, Richard Ashworth stood at the crossroads of his own. Making he'd spent decades building walls so high that even he couldn't see over them anymore. Tomorrow, whether he knew it or not, those walls would begin to crumble. The city sparkled below him, full of life he'd forgotten how to live. Very soon, someone would remind him what it meant to be human again. But first, he had to survive the night alone with his ghosts. Bella Montenegro had exactly $17 in her checking account. When her phone rang at 6 in the morning, she'd been awake for an hour already, making coffee in the tiny kitchen. Of her studio apartment in Astoria, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of hope she couldn't quite afford to feel. "Estrella Home Services. This is Bella." She cradled the phone against her shoulder while folding the same 3 towels she'd been rotating for months. "Ms. Montenegro, this is Vincent from a private residence. We have an urgent placement request." Bella's heart quickened. Urgent usually meant desperate, and desperate usually meant good money. What kind of position? Full domestic management. The previous staff departed rather suddenly. The compensation is $15,000 per month. The towel slipped from Bella's hands. She'd never heard of domestic work paying that much unless it involved something illegal or dangerous. I'm sorry, could you repeat that number? 15,000. The employer values discretion and competence above all else. Bella sank onto her second-hand couch, staring at the stack of overdue bills on her coffee table. Her grandmother's medical debt, her own student loans, the rent she was 3 months behind on. What's the catch? Vincent paused. The employer is, shall we say, particular about his requirements. The previous staff found him challenging. Challenging how? Bella had worked for hoarders, perfectionists, and once a paranoid conspiracy theorist, who made her wear hazmat suits to clean his collection of vintage gas masks. She could handle challenging. Perhaps it's best if you judge for yourself. Can you be at 847 Fifth Avenue at 10 this morning? Bella looked at her reflection in the black screen of her television. 28 years old with wild curls, she could never quite tame in eyes that her abuela used to say held too much hope for someone who'd seen as much disappointment as she had. She'd been cleaning houses since she was 16, working her way through college, then grad school, and the long slide into financial desperation after her grandmother's cancer diagnosis. I'll be there. 2 hours later, she stood before a limestone mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from a European fairy tale. The brass nameplate beside the door read simply, "R. Ashworth." But she recognized the address from newspaper articles about New York's most exclusive real estate. The man who answered the door looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread, titled Billionaire at Rest, tall, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of money could cure. His gray eyes swept over her with the calculating precision of someone accustomed to cataloging assets. "You're the new housekeeper." It wasn't a question. Bella straightened her shoulders and offered her best professional smile. "Bella Montenegro. I prefer to think of myself as a domestic harmony specialist." Something flickered in his expression. Too quick to interpret, "Come in." The interior took her breath away. Soaring ceilings, museum-quality art, furniture that belonged in history books. But there was something wrong with the picture. The space felt more like a mausoleum than a home. No photographs, no personal touches, no signs that anyone actually lived here. "The previous staff handled everything," Richard said, leading her through rooms that echoed with their footsteps. "Cleaning, cooking, maintenance, scheduling, correspondence. I assume you're capable of similar multitasking, of course?" Bella paused beside a massive window overlooking Central Park. "How long were you without staff?" 3 days? She turned to study his face. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Have you been eating?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Beg your pardon?" "Food. You know that thing. Humans do to survive?" She gestured toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "When did you last have a proper meal?" "I don't see how that's your concern." "It's my concern because you hired me to take care of your home and you're part of that equation." She crossed her arms, a gesture her grandmother had taught her. "Never let the powerful make you small, Mia. A house is just walls and furniture without the people who live in it." Richard stared at her for a long moment. "You're very presumptuous for someone I met 5 minutes ago. You're very evasive for someone who's clearly starving." Bella headed toward the kitchen. "Come on, I'll make you breakfast, and you can tell me what you actually need from me." "I don't need anything from you except competent domestic service." She stopped walking and turned back to him. "Mr. Ashworth, with respect, anyone capable of earning $15,000 a month in domestic work doesn't take jobs just for the money. There's always something else. And what's your something else?" Bella looked around the cold perfection of his home, at this man who wore loneliness like an expensive cologne. "I think I just found it." As she headed toward the kitchen, Richard remained frozen in the hallway, watching this stranger move through his space with the confidence of someone who belonged there. For the first time in years, his house felt like it might actually become a home. He didn't know it yet, but his carefully controlled world was about to be turned upside down by a woman who saw possibility where others saw only problems. 3 weeks into what Bella had privately dubbed the Ashworth Project, she'd established a routine that would have impressed a military strategist. Richard woke at 5:30 a.m. sharp, found fresh coffee and a proper breakfast waiting in the breakfast nook she'd created by moving furniture in the cavernous dining room, and left for his office by 7 a.m. without a word. He returned each evening at exactly 6:47 p.m. to find dinner prepared, his mail sorted, and his home transformed from a museum into something resembling a place where humans might actually want to live. They barely spoke beyond professional necessities, but Bella had become a student of Richard Ashworth's silences. She knew he paused outside the kitchen each morning, drawn by the smell of something homemade. She noticed how his shoulders relaxed when he found fresh flowers arranged throughout the house. She'd caught him twice standing in the living room she'd rearranged, simply looking around as if seeing it for the first time. Tonight felt different. She was putting the finishing touches on dinner when she heard his key in the lock, but instead of his usual measured footsteps, she heard nothing at all. Mr. Ashworth. She wiped her hands on her apron and found him standing motionless in the foyer, still wearing his coat, staring at the console table where she'd arranged his mail. "You opened my personal correspondence." His voice carried the kind of deadly quiet that had probably made grown investors weep. Bella's stomach dropped as she realized her mistake. She'd been sorting mail for weeks, but today she'd absently opened what looked like a standard business envelope. "I'm so sorry. It was completely automatic. I didn't think about it being personal mail." She moved toward him slowly, the way you might approach a wounded animal. "I know there's no excuse for that kind of violation of privacy." Richard finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her take a step back. Not anger, but something far more dangerous. Raw, exposed pain. "Do you know what that letter contained, Ms. Montenegro?" She shook her head, afraid to speak. "Divorce papers. Final decree. My ex-wife has remarried." He pulled off his coat with mechanical precision. "Apparently she's having a baby." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Bella had learned enough about Richard over the past weeks to understand that this wasn't just about the letter. This was about a man who'd lost everything that mattered while accumulating everything that didn't. "I should go," she said quietly. "Yes, you should." But as she reached for her coat, something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he was standing there in his perfect suit, in his perfect house, looking like the loneliest man in the world. Maybe it was remembering her grandmother's voice. "Sometimes the people who push hardest are the ones who need someone to push back, Mia." "No," she said. Richard turned sharply. "Excuse me?" said. "No, I'm not leaving." Lessa set down her coat and faced him directly. "You want to fire me for opening your mail? Fine, fire me. But I'm not running away because you're in pain. You don't know anything about my pain. I know you eat dinner alone every night in a house with 12 rooms. I know you've been wearing the same wedding ring for 3 weeks even though you're divorced. I know you stand outside the kitchen every morning like you want to come in and talk to someone, but you never do. It's enough." The words came out like a whip crack. "No, it's not nearly enough." Bella stepped closer, her voice rising. "You hired me to take care of your home, but what you really wanted was someone who would let you disappear. Hell, I won't do it anymore. You want to fire me? Then fire me to my face. Stop hiding behind that wall of politeness and tell me what you really think." Richard stared at her for a long moment, something dangerous building behind his eyes. "You want to know what I think? I think you're an idealistic little girl who watches too many movies and thinks she can fix broken people like they're leaky faucets. I think you see a rich, sad man and you fantasize about being the one special enough to save him." Each word hit like a physical blow, but Bella held her ground. "Is that what you think? That I'm here because I want to play savior to some tragic billionaire, aren't you? I'm here because I need the money, and you need someone who isn't afraid of you." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But mostly I'm here because for the first time in months, I wake up knowing that someone needs me. Not my services, not my work. Me." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and completely unguarded. Richard's carefully constructed anger seemed to deflate, leaving something raw and uncertain in its place. "Bella," Her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before. Not employer to employee, but man to woman, should have asked. "Before opening your mail," she said. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Keep talking to me like I'm human instead of a bank account, and I'll consider us even." She smiled then, the first real smile she'd given him since that first day. "Deal. But I'm making you something stronger than coffee. You look like you need it." As she headed back toward the kitchen, Richard called after her. "Bella." "The letter. About my ex-wife having a baby? It doesn't matter." She turned back. "It matters enough to hurt you. What hurts is realizing I feel more genuine connection with my housekeeper than I ever did with my wife." The confession hung between them like a lit fuse, dangerous and full of possibility. Bella felt her cheeks flush as the meaning sank in. "Mr. Ashworth, ... Double quotes Richard. If we're going to acknowledge that I'm human, you might as well use my name." Something had shifted between them, subtle but unmistakable. The careful professional distance they'd maintained was cracking, revealing something neither of them was quite ready to name. But it was there now, in the air between them, changing everything. The thunderstorm that hit Manhattan 2 days later seemed to mirror the electricity that had been building between them since the night of the letter. Bella arrived at the house to find Richard still there at 8 a.m., standing at the kitchen window, with his coffee, watching sheets of rain lash against the glass. "No office today?" she asked, setting down her bag and trying to ignore how different he looked in casual clothes. The perfectly pressed suits had hidden the fact that Richard Ashworth had the build of a man who'd once played sports. All long lines and lean muscle, meetings canceled. "Apparently the partners think I need a mental health day," he turned from the window. Their words, not mine. Smart partners. Bella began unpacking groceries, hyper-aware of his presence in the kitchen. Over the past month, they'd settled into an easy rhythm of shared spaces, but today felt different, charged. "I've been thinking about what you said, about needing someone who needs you." She paused, a bunch of basil halfway to the counter. "Richard, you don't have to. I've been alone for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care. Whether I lived or died." His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but she could hear the weight behind the words. "My ex-wife was right about me becoming a machine. I'd convinced myself it was necessary for success." Bella set down the basil and faced him fully. "What changed your mind?" "You did. The way you rearranged the furniture so the living room faced the windows instead of the television. The way you hum while you cook. The way you leave books lying around like you actually live here." He stepped closer. "The way you look at me like I'm worth saving." "Richard." His name came out as barely a whisper. "I know this is inappropriate. I know you work for me, and there's a power dynamic that makes this complicated." He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, see the gray flecks in his eyes. "But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is professional." Bella's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been fighting her growing attraction to him for weeks, telling herself it was just proximity and loneliness, and the danger of being needed by someone so completely. But standing here with rain painting patterns on the windows, and Richard looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. She couldn't lie anymore. "I can't afford to feel this way about you," she said.
"Neither can."
But I do." The admission hung between them for a heartbeat before Richard closed the distance, his hands framing her face with surprising gentleness. "Tell me to stop." Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was supposed to be soft, tentative, a question rather than a statement. Instead, it ignited something desperate and hungry in both of them. His hands tangled in her hair, her fingers clutched at his shirt, and suddenly they were kissing like drowning people who'd just found air. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Bella pressed her forehead against his chest. "This is insane. Completely." His arms tightened around her. "I don't care. I work for you. I'll fire you right now if that's what it takes." She laughed despite herself. "And then what would I do for money? Let me take care of you." The words hit her like cold water. She pulled back to look at him. "What did you just say?" "I said let me take care of you. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. You'd never have to worry about bills or rent or... Stop. Bella stepped out of his arms, her chest tight with sudden panic. Just stop talking. Richard's expression shifted to confusion. Bella, what's wrong? What's wrong is that you just went from kissing me like I matter to offering to keep me like a pet. The hurt in her voice surprised even her. Do you have any idea how that sounds? I was trying to solve your problems. My problems aren't yours to solve. She grabbed her coat from the chair. I'm not some charity case you can fix with your checkbook. That's not what I meant, isn't it? She faced him, tears of frustration burning her eyes. You kissed me and 30 seconds later you're talking about taking care of me financially. How is that different from hiring a very expensive escort? Richard recoiled as if she'd slapped him. You know that's not what this is, do I? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the billionaire decided he wants to sleep with the help and assumes everything has a price. She shrugged into her coat. Maybe your ex-wife was right about you being a machine. Machines solve everything with transactions. She was at the door when his voice stopped her. My father kept a mistress for 12 years. Bella turned back. Slowly, I was 10 when I found out. I saw him giving her money and I asked my mother what it meant. She explained that some men think love is something you buy. Richard's voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes. I swore I'd never become that kind of man. The fight went out of her all at once. Richard, I wasn't trying to keep you, I was trying to free you. He ran his hands through his hair. I thought if you didn't have to worry about money, you could choose to be with me because you wanted to, not because you needed the job. Bella stood frozen in the doorway, her hand on the brass handle, realizing she'd just made the same mistake she'd accused him of making. She'd reduced his feelings to their most cynical interpretation, just like he'd reduced hers to a financial transaction. I'm scared, she said finally. Of what? Of this? Of you? Of the way you make me feel? She turned back to face him. I've never felt this way about anyone, and you could destroy me without even trying. I would never hurt you. You wouldn't mean to. But Richard, look at your life. Look at mine. This isn't a fairy tale where the prince and the cleaning lady live happily ever after. Why not? The simple question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Why not indeed? Because society said so. Because it was complicated. Because she was afraid. Before she could answer, Richard's phone rang, sharp and insistent. He ignored it. Answer it, Bella said. It might be important. He grabbed the phone without looking away from her. What? Even from across the room, she could hear Vincent's panicked voice through the speaker. Richard, you need to turn on the news. Now. Channel 7. Something in his assistant's tone made Richard reach for the remote. The kitchen television flickered to life, showing a news anchor with breaking news scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Double quotes. ... Federal investigation into Ashworth Capital Management has expanded. With sources confirming that Richard Ashworth himself is now the target of a criminal probe into insider trading allegations that could result in decades in prison, the remote slipped from Richard's fingers, clattering to the marble floor. Bella watched his face transform. The vulnerability of moments before replaced by the cold mask she'd worked so hard to strip away. I have to go, he said, already reaching for his coat. Richard, wait. He paused at the door, not turning around. You were right, Bella. This isn't a fairy tale. I'm about to become exactly the kind of man you shouldn't be associated with. The door closed behind him with quiet finality, leaving Bella alone in the kitchen with the taste of him still on her lips and the sound of his world collapsing on the television screen. Outside, the storm raged on, and she realized that everything was about to change. Bella didn't see Richard for 6 days. She continued coming to the house, maintaining routines that felt increasingly pointless. She cooked meals that went uneaten, arranged flowers that no one saw, and watched the news coverage of Richard's case with a mixture of dread and fierce protectiveness that surprised her. The media painted him as the villain in a classic tale of Wall Street greed. Insider trading, market manipulation, fraud charges that could put him away for 30 years. But Bella had seen the man behind the headlines, had watched him struggle to remember how to be human, and she knew there was more to the story. On the 7th day, she found him in his study at 3 a.m. He looked like he'd aged a decade in a week. Unshaven, wearing the same clothes from yesterday, surrounded by legal documents and empty coffee cups. The man who'd once controlled billions of dollars was reduced to fighting for his freedom with paperwork and desperate phone calls. "You shouldn't be here," he said, without looking up from the contract he was reading. "Neither should you. When's the last time you slept?" "Can't remember." Finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "Bella, I meant what I said. You need to stay away from me. This is going to get ugly." She set down the coffee she'd made for him and took the seat across from his desk. "Tell me what really happened." "What really happened is that I made decisions that benefited my clients and myself, and now the government wants to make an example of me." His voice was flat, exhausted. "Technicalities don't matter. I'm going to prison." "I don't believe that." "Why not?" "What?" "Everyone else does." He gestured to the television in the corner, muted but showing another news report about his case. "My own lawyers are suggesting I take a plea deal." Bella studied his face, seeing past the exhaustion to the fear underneath. "You're not telling?" "Me everything." Richard was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. No. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There was a whistleblower. Someone inside my company who's been feeding information to the FBI for months." He looked up at her. "I think it was Marcus." Marcus, Richard's business partner of 15 years. The man he'd trusted with his company and his secrets. The betrayal would have cut deeper than any government investigation. "Are you sure?" "Sure enough. Timing of the investigation. The specific trades they're questioning. It had to be someone with access to everything." Richard rubbed his face with both hands. "I keep trying to figure out why. Was it money? Revenge? Or did he just decide, I deserved this?" Bella moved around the desk to stand beside his chair. Without thinking, she placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension coiled there like steel cables. Maybe he thought he was doing the right thing, she said quietly. "Maybe I deserved it." "Stop." I turned his chair so he was facing her. "Whatever mistakes you made, whatever corners you cut, you're not the monster they're painting you as. How can you be so sure?" "Because I've lived with you for 2 months. I've seen how you treat people when you think no one's watching. Seen your kindness and your loneliness and your desperate need to matter to someone." She knelt beside his chair. "The man I know wouldn't deliberately hurt innocent people." Richard reached out to touch her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "What did I do to deserve you? Let me see who you really are?" He leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and desperate and full of goodbye. When they broke apart, she could see the decision in his eyes. "I'm going to turn myself in tomorrow," he said. "Richard, no. Fight this." "With what?" "My reputation is destroyed, my assets are frozen, and my closest friend sold me out to the FBI." He stood up, pacing to the window. "At least if I cooperate, maybe I can minimize the damage to my employees." "What about minimizing the damage to yourself? What's left to damage?" He turned back to her. "Bella, I need you to promise me something." She shook her head. "Don't. When this goes public tomorrow, when they arrest me, I need you to disappear. Change your phone number. Don't talk to reporters. Don't visit me in prison. Just vanish. I won't do that. You have to. Being associated with me will destroy your life. My life was already destroyed before I met you." She stood up, moving toward him. "You want to know why I really took this job? It wasn't just the money. It was because I had nothing left to hope for. My grandmother was dead, my dreams were dead, and I was working 3 jobs just to stay broke." Bella ... "You gave me something to care about again. You made me remember what it feels like to matter to someone." She reached for his hands. "I'm not walking away from that. I'm not walking away from you." Richard pulled her against him, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted off its axis. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I know it's too soon and too complicated and probably the worst possible timing, but I love you. I love you too." The words came out without hesitation, surprising them both with their certainty. And I'm going to prove it. Before he could ask what she meant, Bella was moving. She grabbed her phone from her purse and dialed a number from memory. "Who are you calling?" "My cousin Elena. She's an investigative journalist for the Washington Post." Bella held up a finger as the call connected. "Elena, it's Bella. I need a favor, and it's big." Over the next hour, with Richard listening in growing amazement, Bella laid out everything she'd observed about his business practices, his character, and her suspicions about Marcus. Elena, sensing a story that could make her career, agreed. To investigate, she need access to company records, employee interviews. "It's anything that can paint a fuller picture," Bella explained after hanging up. "She thinks there might be a pattern of Marcus positioning himself to take over the company once you're out of the picture." Richard stared at her. He realized this could implicate you as an accessory. Let them try to prove it. Bella smiled. "I'm just a housekeeper who pays attention. You're incredible. I'm invested." She moved back into his arms. "Richard, I can't promise this will work, but I can promise I'm not going anywhere." They spent the rest of the night in his study, making phone calls, reviewing documents, and building a case for Richard's innocence. As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of possibility, they had the beginnings of a defense strategy that might actually work. 6 months later, Bella stood in the marble foyer of the house on Fifth Avenue, watching Richard adjust his tie in the mirror. The charges against him had been dropped after Elena's investigation revealed Marcus's systematic embezzlement and frame job. Richard's reputation was rebuilding slowly, but his empire was intact. "Ready?" she asked. He turned to her, and she was struck again by how much he'd changed. The cold perfection was gone, replaced by something warmer and infinitely more attractive. Humanity looked good on him. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, taking her hands. Bella looked down at the simple solitaire on her left ring finger, then back up at the man who'd asked her to marry him, not because he wanted to take care of her, but because he couldn't imagine his life without her fierce loyalty and stubborn hope. "I've never been more sure of anything." They walked out of the house together, into the bright promise of a New York morning, leaving behind the gilded cage that had once trapped them both. Richard Ashworth had learned that some things couldn't be bought, and Bella Montenegro had discovered that sometimes the most broken people were just waiting for someone brave enough to love them back to wholeness. In the end, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. The end.